Um, Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us to our webinar today. Welcome to the Resilience at PNNL and specifically the GODEEEP webinar series. GODEEEP stands for Grid Operations, Decarbonization, Environmental and Energy Equity Platform. My name is Natalie Boysen, and I'm one of the co-PIs, one of the PIs for GODEEEP, and I will be your host today. The GODEEEP webinar series started on June 12th with an overall presentation, and now we're going through deep dive that are more technical, in-depth, presented by our technical experts with the objective to further engage the audience for more technical questions, for collaborations, and also for engage with the users. So if you missed any of our deep dive so far, please check for godeep.pnnl.gov, and I'll provide a link later for any of the webinars that you may have missed. Today, the webinar is presented. We are deep dive 2, and we're presenting on incorporating socioeconomics and natural resources impacts on new infrastructure siting. Our experts are Kendall Mungard, Konstantinos Oikonomou, and Stefan Rose. Let me introduce our speakers. Kendall Mungard is a research economist in the Economics, Policy, and Institutional Support Group at PNNL. She's the lead developer for the geospatial power plant siting model called SURF. She also contributes to studies on water energy resilience, distributed energy resource valuation, and energy storage cost and performance evaluation. Kendall holds a master's degree in economics from the University of Edinburgh. Dr. Konstantinos Oikonomou is an electrical engineer in the Electricity Infrastructure Group at PNNL. He is the lead bulk power system production cost modeler in GODEEEP. His main areas of expertise include the operations, optimizations, economics, and resilience of interdependent critical infrastructure, and the design of electricity market participation frameworks. He also contributes to studies on multi-scale interactions and feedbacks across power and water systems. Kostas holds a PhD in electrical engineering from the University of Utah. And finally, but not least, Stefan Rose is our geospatial data scientist in the Earth System Predictability and Resiliency Group at PNNL. He is the lead developer of the Energy Justice Visualization and Impact Analysis, EJ VIA, which is a tool for GODEEEP. He has previous work experience in energy consulting, evaluating utility programs focused on renewable energy access and equity within disadvantaged communities. Stefan holds a master's degree in geography from Oregon State University. The presentation is going to go for 45 minutes, and we will have a place for questions at midway for any clarification questions. And after the results and all of the analytics, we will have a much longer Q&A sessions where you can put all of your presentation in the chat. And without further ado, Kendall, take it away.
Get my camera going there. Hopefully everybody can see me. Great. Thank you very much, Natalie, and welcome everybody to the second deep dive of the GODEEEP webinar series. As Natalie said, I'm Kendall Mungard. I'm an economist here at PNNL. And today I'm very excited to go through this webinar with you on incorporating socioeconomic and natural resource impacts into new infrastructure siting. Next slide, please. So before we go into the deep dive here and go into the details of the modeling efforts, I do want to give a brief background on the GODEEEP project overall. GODEEEP stands for Grid Operations, Decarbonization, Environmental, and Energy Equity Platform. It's a $4 million PNNL R&D project, and it works to coordinate a lot of different expertise and backgrounds so that we can explore questions and analytics on these 4 different categories you see here. These include empowering stakeholders through methods, tools, and data sets, looking at resilience and reliability of the grid, looking at different decarbonization pathways and exploring things there. And then lastly, folding in justice and equity considerations into each of these categories as well. And we're really only able to do this by leveraging the wide variety of expertise that we have available to us at the lab. Our team consists of atmospheric scientists, hydrologists, electrical engineers, social scientists and economists like myself, as well as software engineers and stakeholder engagement experts. So we have a lot of different expertise and a lot of different background that let us explore a wide variety of questions in this space. Next slide, please. So how do we even begin to look at a decarbonization scenario? How do we approach the GODEEEP project overall? And how does a long-term plan under a decarbonization scenario look like? What are the different factors we need to consider? So what the GODEEEP project does is we connect various numerical models and we go from these large-scale, high-level roadmaps all the way down to a much more detailed analysis. Our high-level roadmaps include large signals such as climate change and decarbonization policies, and these are all fed into our human Earth systems model that altogether give us these kind of regional, coarser scale information sets that can then be passed into our downstream models. Now, these downstream models that we integrate at the middle stage here are much more detailed, much more granular, and that's a really important consideration because when we have these larger decarbonization goals, those are generally coarser scale, and we need these much more detailed data sets and insights to be able to do a sort of ground truthing or see the feasibility of these different decarbonization pathways. So these middle modeling efforts here that you can see include renewable time series profiles, which are on an hourly basis, electricity demand, which is also on an hourly basis. And if you're interested in that component, the previous webinar was focused on that. So I encourage you to go and check out the recording of that if you would like to see more on the modeling efforts there. And then lastly, we're also able to take all this weather information, climate change, decarbonization policies, and these larger scale signals and bring it into a high granularity geospatial power plant siting model called SURF, which is what I'll talk about for a large portion of today's webinar. And this is important because we need this high resolution, and so 1 square kilometer power plant siting model, so that we can actually test the feasibility, the sort of ground truthing of our larger scale goals and decarbonization plans. All of this information in the middle here, these renewable time series profiles, our electricity demand, and this new infrastructure build out, these actual power plant siting outputs from our modeling efforts, then get folded into our power grid operations model, which we'll also be talking about today. And this is important as well because it's another sort of feasibility test of our build out of our various decarbonization goals, where we need to know, can our decarbonization, our clean grid actually operate successfully on the grid, and what are some of the outputs and some of the impacts that we'll see by putting all these new renewable energy resources and the like on the grid. And then lastly, we have this component that looks at the impacts on consumers and equity. This is a really key component, and we're actually, you can see those arrows are folding back in. We are able to look at our modeling efforts through this environmental and energy justice lens and better inform our modeling efforts, and we'll get into that quite a bit more in our webinar today. Next slide, please. So today's focus, I've already said this a little bit, but we're really going to go into the deep dive on these 3 components that you see highlighted here. We're going to talk about the new infrastructure siting, the grid operations, and how those 2 models speak to each other and how we're able to incorporate our infrastructure build-outs into grid operations, and then how we fold those impacts on consumers and the equity considerations into those modeling efforts as well. Next slide, please. So why is that last component even important? Why do we want to fold in these environmental justice and equity considerations into our modeling to begin with? Well, if you've read the news recently, or you've even over the last few years, you may have seen headlines that look like this or something, or you may have seen these exact ones, where we're finding that as we go towards our clean grid goals and we're putting new renewable resources on the ground, we're retiring fossil generation, it's a complex process. There is a variety of impacts that we're seeing. There's a variety of perspectives in the communities where these changes are actually happening. There's positive impacts from opportunities in jobs and economic recovery or impacts there. And then there's also, we're seeing some opposition in some places for environmental conservation reasons or various community impacts. And so you may have one development actually sparking this debate over what the trade-offs are and what the opportunities are and where the best place is to put these resources that we're going to need to put on the ground to meet our decarbonization goals. So this is a really, really critical aspect that we need to consider what the feasibility and also the impacts are of these communities, and be able to fold that back into our modeling efforts so that we can take from this wide array of decarbonization pathways, we're able to downscale them into something maybe a little bit more realistic with a higher chance of success. And we're only able to do this by considering these socioeconomic and energy and environmental justice considerations. Next slide, please. So before we get into the modeling efforts, which is going to be the first half of this webinar, and the second half will cover more of the results, I want to give you kind of a sneak peek into what the key findings that you'll see in this webinar. And the webinar will walk you through how we actually get to these findings, but I always find it nice to start with what are we heading for in our webinar. And so when looking at our decarbonization modeling efforts and our power plant siting build out through 2035 in the West, we're able to get a few kind of high level key takeaways, which are presented here. First, we find that nearly half of our new infrastructure build out is sited on federally identified disadvantaged community land. And we'll go into detail a bit more about what exactly we mean by that, by federally identified disadvantaged communities, and go into a bit more detail in that exact geospatial information more specifically. The second component that I want to highlight as a key finding is that about 12% of the land required for new infrastructure under our 2035 clean electricity build out is on important farmland. This is equivalent to about 2,100 square kilometers, about 800 square miles. And it's most prevalent in Oregon and Washington. And again, I'll go into more detail later on what we mean by important farmland and some of the more detailed nuances in that takeaway specifically. The last component here is that we're finding that about 60% of the land for new infrastructure is projected to be within about 5 kilometers of environmental or protected areas. This has the potential for impacts on conservation goals, and this is maybe where we'll see a higher potential for local opposition to siting, or where I mean by that new infrastructure in these areas, even if they are legally allowed to proceed, may have to go through additional stages of environmental impact assessment, and it may be a longer time frame there. And again, we'll go into more detail on that later. And more specifically tied to this, we're seeing that that particular 6% within 5 kilometers is especially within Oregon, Utah, and California. And those states in particular may require additional evaluation and local collaboration and insights to be able to move forward on projects in those locations. So we'll go into that a bit more later on. And I do want to point out that all of these projections that we'll walk through today, the data sets behind everything we're doing here, will be made available on the GODEEEP website. There's a QR code there if you'd like to scan it, and I'm sure a link will be provided in the chat if it hasn't already. Next slide, please. So this is coming back to the workflow that I showed a few slides ago, but this is a zoom in to what specifically we're going to be talking about today. We have the SURF model there, which was the portion that I'll cover at the beginning here. And I'm going to talk about how we fold in these upstream components like climate, our capacity expansion plan from GCAM USA, and the natural resource availability, and how that all factors into our power plant siting model. I'll be covering that in the first portion here. Afterwards, I'll hand off to Costas, who will walk through how we fold in those power plant siting projections into our grid operations modeling. And then lastly, Stefan will walk through how all of the energy and equity components from a geospatial perspective can then be folded back into the SURF modeling. That'll cover the first half of this webinar. The second half will go into more detail on the results that I just walked through on that key findings slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So there's a lot going on this slide. This is intended to convey the sort of workflow that we use to be able to use the SURF model in siting power plants and looking at a build out of various scenario infrastructures. And I'm going to walk through this hopefully slowly enough so that you can get an idea of not only the complex nature of what this process takes to actually be able to do projections of power plant siting on a high granularity, but also how the SURF model interacts with other upstream and downstream models as well. SURF stands for Capacity Expansion Regional Feasibility Model, and that feasibility component is really important because it's intended to provide a ground truthing to our capacity expansion plans. So as you can see in that box in the upper left-hand side, we get the capacity expansion plan for the GODEEEP project from GCAM USA. If you're interested in the GCAM USA build out component, I encourage you to watch the previous webinar where Yang went through some of the modeling efforts there in a lot more detail. I'm not going to focus on that capacity expansion plan today because that was covered in the previous webinar. So what GCAM USA gives the SURF model is our regional aggregate goals, so to speak. It is our capacity expansion plan. And you can see that it's essentially an aggregate value that we're working with to begin with. So for example, GCAM USA could tell us that in 2030 in Wyoming, we need to site 500 megawatts worth of wind. That's the information that is passed to the SURF model. And it's SURF's job to take that aggregate value in that state, in that region, and break it apart and actually site individual power plants on a 1 square kilometer basis. And it does this by going through a few different steps. The first step is to apply a geospatial constraint component. And what this does is it takes various geospatial layers and aggregates them to determine where each technology type can and cannot go on the ground. So it will block out individual 1 square kilometer grid cells and then be able to see in a given state for a given technology what land is actually available for siting. And this is meant to emulate various social and policy-based constraints that we actually see in the US today. The second component of the SURF model is an economic algorithm. So once we've determined what space is actually available for siting, we need to determine where's the best place for that power plant to go. Now this has two components. It has both an interconnection cost component, so what's the cost to interconnect to the grid from each 1 square kilometer space, but also what's the value. If we were to put a power plant there, what's the expected revenue that we could get from operating in that location? That second component is where the grid view model outputs come in. Grid view gives us our energy prices. So there's this evolving component where grid view will operate the power plants in its infrastructure set, and we can determine for every single substation in this nodal database what the energy prices are for a given year at a given time. And that information is passed and ingested into SURF. SURF uses this information plus the interconnection cost algorithm to essentially give us that output you see on the far right hand side there. We have a nice data set that actually has coordinates where we are able to say there is a wind farm here, there is a biomass plant here, and it's a general data set that you see on the right hand side. One thing that I want to communicate that's really important as part of this workflow, you'll notice those orange lines, orange arrows in the middle there, that there's a cyclical component. This is by design, and we're not jumping straight to 2035 with our infrastructure build out. We are actually evolving the grid. So we have grid view run, and it provides our initial set of energy prices. And then SURF will actually cite a 2025 build out from GCAM USA and add that new additional infrastructure to the overall set of infrastructure that GridView runs on. That information is passed back to GridView. GridView updates its database and actually updates our energy prices. This is then passed back to SURF, which then does the next round of siting for 2030. And we proceed through in these 5-year time steps so that we have this evolving grid nature, and we're actually able to look at how things will change on that time step. And the other component, so that is one model that the SURF output goes to. This other component is the equity and environmental justice piece, which Stefan will be talking about later on. And this allows us to look at our projected power plant sightings and the individual locations and coordinates of where those are going and see what kinds of communities, what kinds of geospatial areas that are actually being sited in. This allows us to bring in that equity lens so that we can see where our projections are potentially going to impact. I do want to note that the equity consideration for this webinar is just going to be focused on this geospatial component. There is a larger equity component as part of the overall GODEEEP project, and that's going to be covered in a lot more detail in the 4th deep dive. So I encourage you to sign up and attend that one. Next slide, please. The next few slides are just going to go into a little bit more detail on some of this SURF siting economic algorithm, as well as the geospatial component, just to do this actually, this deeper deep dive here. For those of you that enjoy to see the math, this is our net locational cost component. This is what SURF uses to actually do that economic algorithm to determine the best location to site a power plant. And you can see by the equation at the bottom there that it's essentially doing a trade-off between that interconnection cost and that net operating value. And we determine interconnection cost by looking at each square kilometer what the interconnection cost is to connect to the existing substation infrastructure. So how much transmission do we need to build to connect to a substation one location versus another, and that'll get factored into this overall calculation. That second component is where that grid view output comes in that I talked about. This is where our energy prices come in, and in that exact same square kilometer, we're able to determine if we site this power plant here, interconnection cost is A, and our operational value given our locational marginal prices from grid view and our operating cost is B. And we're able to calculate these trade-offs. This is done across every single available grid cell to determine which one is the optimal location to actually site in. And this is how we get our output. Next slide, please. The second component I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on just briefly here is the geospatial suitability component. This is a really important component because this is what sets our sort of baseline for determining where we can even go to begin with. So at our, as the beginning part of our analysis, we use a really wide range of geospatial layers that we've accumulated to be able to do this modeling effort. They're the result of a really detailed literature review that look to see what are the actual social land and policy-based constraints that developers are facing in the US today. These different layers can include things like legally protected environmental areas. They can correspond to cooling water availability for technologies that need that information, population density, renewable resource potential, and many, many more. And we actually use these in aggregate and are able to pull from each of these individual layers to improve our siting decisions and feed it into our overall modeling process. Next slide, please. So as you can see in this diagram on the right-hand side, each of these layers are uniquely stacked together to determine the siting suitability per technology. So we'll have at our disposal over 80 different unique geospatial suitability layers, except I want to call those more categories because there are subsets of those layers that are actually dynamic, both temporally, or they go along with the SSP scenarios, which are shared socioeconomic pathways, or they could correspond to resource potential in the case of wind and solar. And what I mean by that is I'm going to use the example of population density, where we have projections of how that population density will change over time through different geospatial layers. And corresponding to whatever year we're modeling, we'll actually pull in that population density restriction or that siting geospatial layer and be able to better model that specific opportunity there. So we may be able to use population density as it is projected to look in 2050 when we're citing a 2050 scenario. And as a result, based on those dynamic components, we actually are able to pull from over 300 different geospatial layers in total. This is quite a feat, and we're actually always continuously adding to this set of geospatial information. And I do want to note this is in the process of being minted, and it will be an available data set for people that want to come in and play around with the different geospatial layers that we're using. Based on these different geospatial layers, we're able to cite 79 different power plant technology configurations. Again, this list is always growing, but in general, that means we have our larger categories of technologies. We have biomass, natural gas, geothermal, wind, what have you. And then we additionally have subcategories of each of those technologies: conventional biomass, CC, natural gas, combustion turbine. We also have this with and without carbon capture sequestration. And then for technologies that require it, we have different cooling types. So you'll see different layers get toggled on and off to fit to these various technology considerations. In addition to our base layers that I'm describing here, so things that are meant to emulate those actual social policy-based constraints. We've additionally collected a subset of geospatial layers that let us do the kind of analysis that we're going to walk through here. And those represent things like potential policy or disadvantaged communities, or layers that we're really interested in exploring that represent that equity and environmental justice lens. So even though they're not added into the base case, so to speak, of our siting, we're able to explore them through a wide variety of sensitivity analysis and really expand the insights that we're able to glean through this process. So that's where I'm going to wrap up the overview on the SURF model in particular. Next, I'm going to hand it off to Costas to talk through a little bit more about the grid view model and the grid operations of these power plant siting data sets. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kendall. Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for taking the time to attend this webinar. My name is Socioeconomic, and I'm an electrical engineer. In the next 7 slides, I will present the power grid operations model, grid view, that we use in the GODEEEP decarbonization experiments, the inputs that grid view receives from SURF, the grid view outputs, how these outputs are used to iteratively inform self-siting decisions, as Kendall pointed out in her presentation. And I will also discuss the importance of reliability assessment in deep decarbonization studies. Next slide, please. So what is grid view? Short answer, grid view is a high resolution production cost model used by WEC for reliability studies. It receives a large number of modeling inputs, such as transmission lines, generation, and load information, and solves an optimization problem, which basically minimizes the generation cost for meeting the electricity demand and ancillary service requirements. This problem is solved at an hourly scale for an entire year. And from an electricity market's perspective, it can be seen as the day-ahead scheduling problem. Some of its key outputs includes the energy prices, which we also refer to as locational marginal prices, the power dispatch of the generation fleet, and the carbon dioxide emissions of thermal units. Within the context of GODEEEP, we use grid view to first provide the economic incentives to SURF at its intermediate time step until we reach the target year 2035. And second, to make sure that the reliability of the power grid is ensured at its time step. Before getting into more details about those 2 points, I would like to first present the industry planning case from WEC that we use in grid view to represent the transmission network topology of the Western interconnection. Please allow me to start by saying that WEC, for those who don't know, is the Western Electricity Coordinating Council, which promotes bulk electric system reliability for the entire Western interconnection system. One of WEC's roles is to prepare the industry planning cases that help decision makers define strategic transmission and generation planning choices for managing an uncertain future. The WEC cases are created using inputs from all the Western interconnection stakeholders and contain the best available load generation transmission predictions looking 10 years into the future. In GODEEEP, we use the WEC 2030 anchor datasets. However, because GCAM uses 2020 generation mix information, we had to harmonize the generation mix between GCAM and the WEC 2030 datasets. To do so, we created the backcast 2020 case, starting from the 2030 datasets as a starting point, and through retiring or reactivating generation capacity based on the EIA 860 capacity datasets for the year 2020. One thing that I forgot to mention is that the WEC planning cases consists of 10 of thousands of transmission nodes and lines, which shows the level of realism that these studies bring when used to benchmark siting decisions under different decarbonization scenarios. Another important thing that I would like to mention is that the 2020 backcast is used as the first time point, and Kendall explained that in her presentation. The next time points are the years 2025, 2030, and 2035, where at each time point, GridView database is updated with SERF's generation and retirement decisions. And I will talk more about those 2 points in the next slides. Next slide, please. Thank you. One of the most challenging steps we face in GODEEEP was to update the GridView database with the self-siting and retirement decisions. And specifically, there were two main challenges. Number one was that GridView's database is vast, complex, and sensitive to small errors in data formatting. Because SERF cites hundreds of new resources, we must update multiple database entries associated with those new elements. Just to give you an example, in order to add one new natural gas power plant, we have to include all its technical characteristics, such as heat rates, capacity, fuel costs, ramping information, and also map this unit to the specific substation that SERF decides to connect to it. To be able to make all those updates fast and reliably, we develop scripts that automate the process for creating the GridView databases with self-generation retirement information. The second challenge goes to identify the specific retirements of thermal power plants. And this is because GCAM reports thermal capacity retirements at the state level, which we then need to disaggregate to specific power plants in GridView's database. Once we have successfully updated the GridView database with self-capacity and retirement inputs, we run then GridView to retrieve key operational metrics, including the energy prices that are used by SERF in the next intermediate time step. Next slide, please. And now I would like to zoom in a bit more to the process that we follow to assign the locational energy prices, which is a GridView input to the specific SERF areas. In GridView, as you can see on the left map, there is a set of eligible substations that we have defined as potential points to interconnect new generation resources. Using the GIS coordinates of these substations, SERF creates the Voronoi polygons in the middle map, where each polygon contains exactly one substation point. We then map and assign its GridView nodal marginal price to the geospatial area of each SERF polygon, and the resulting geospatial areas represent the LMP zones that are used by SERF as one of the decision-making parameters for siting new generation sources, which are then mapped back to the GridView substations. That's on the right map. Next slide, please. Thank you. One important aspect in this handshake between GCAM, SERF, and GridView is to maintain the reliability of the grid, and more broadly, to understand any potential operational or economic implications that could result from the deep decarbonization scenarios. Adding high levels of mass take intermittent generation can lead to over-generation periods, which in turn could lead to high levels of renewables curtailment, especially during low load conditions. Having too much renewable curtailment could act as a bad signal for future renewable investments that can impact also overall societal benefits. Renewable curtailment is also responsible to lowering the energy prices or even setting negative prices as a result of the production tax credit. Which is also a bad signal for investments, especially in market-based environments. Renewable overgeneration could also lead to transmission congestion by maximizing the transfer limits of the lines. Having many lines that operate at their maximum capacity poses a high reliability risk in the event of a line outage, and because the system could lose a significant portion of its power delivery. Finally, the combination of transmission congestion and high levels of renewable generation could lead to hours of unserved energy when flexible resources are far from load centers and can't provide enough ramping during the sudden net load changes. Next slide, please. So now that we are aware of those challenges, the question is, what are our options to fine-tune the network so that it can accept the self-decarbonization scenarios while mitigating the impact of these issues? In this table, we summarize those options, categorize them into technology, market design, and out-of-market policies. As you can see, there are multiple options. For the sake of time, I will highlight that in GODEEP, we focus on integrating energy storage technologies, but at the same time, we call for collaboration on other approaches mentioned here. Regarding the energy storage, we have a dedicated task in GODEEP. There will be a future deep dive on that, which we will explore the optimal sizing and siting decisions of storage technologies. And there will be a future webinar on this regard. Next slide, please. Yeah, and with that, I concluded my presentation. I will now hand it over to Stefan, who will be presenting the environmental and energy equity and justice tool. Thank you.
Thank you, Kostas. And good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. Thank you for attending today. My name is Stefan Rose. I'm a geospatial data scientist here at PNNL. So I want to briefly switch gears and talk a little bit about some of the equity considerations within power plant siting and energy infrastructure investment that, as Kendall mentioned, will be confined to for today to talk just about the geospatial equity considerations that I'll speak to a little bit more of what we do within the GODEEEP team related to equity considerations a little bit later on. Next slide, please. I want to briefly highlight a capability we have developed with the help of the GODEEEP team and myself, and that is a platform that is intended to assist users, planners, practitioners in how they visualize and analyze our GODEEEP data products, such as projected new, retired, existing power plants, emissions from those power plants, and other indicators that are in relation to disadvantaged communities or DACs, which I'll be touching on a bit more in a minute. But this tool is still forthcoming and still actively in development, but it will soon be published on our GODEEEP website, and it will be a more prominent part of our deep dive 4 occurring on August 7th. So I invite you all to please tune in and to learn more about this tool and how it can be used. But this is a capability we're really excited about, and we think will really help users of our data products navigate some of the complexities around the different geospatial considerations of equity. In the meantime, I'd like to take a few minutes to speak more about disadvantaged communities themselves and what they are and how they can be considered in this context. So first of all, what are disadvantaged communities or DACs in general? They can generally be referred to as geographic areas designated by federal, state, or local agencies as marginalized, underserved, and overburdened by a combination of economic, health, and environmental factors. These factors vary, but they could include considerations like exposure to air pollutants, proximity to heavy traffic roadways, transportation expenses, commute times, unaffordable housing, unemployment, and other considerations along those lines. Now, it's important to note that the definitions and methodologies for determining whether a geographic area meets DAC status requirements varies by the agency or entity defining it, and this creates different outcomes on a map of where designated communities are. I'll hope to explain and examine this a bit further in an example in the next few slides. But on this slide, you'll see a table overviewing some of the current prominent DAC designation methodologies, both at the federal level and at the state level. And please note that this is not an exhaustive list by any means, and that there are some city or municipality definitions being developed as well. But these are some of the more common ones you'll see used and referred to, especially within our GODEEEP data project. All of these examples define DACs at the census tract scale, although some additional geographic resolutions may be available as well, depending on the location. Now I'm going to walk through an example of two of these DAC definitions so we can explore some of the differences spatially and how they may affect planning decisions. So this first definition that we'll look at is the federally created definition called the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, or CJUST. This was created as a part of President Biden's Justice 40 initiative, which sets a goal of 40% of overall benefits of certain federal investments that flow towards communities that are identified as DACs. And this is a definition used as a threshold approach to determining if a census tract is or is not a disadvantaged community. What I mean by this is that examining over 30 different indicators, including socioeconomic, energy, health, and climate variables, if a census tract exceeds any of those thresholds within those indicators, it will be considered disadvantaged. Additionally, it would also be a DAC if it is surrounded by DAC census tract and is below a low income threshold or is on land within federally recognized tribe. There is percentile normalization of units throughout the data set. And on the slide, you'll see a couple of screenshots of the map provided on the CJUST website, and where you're welcome to read more about this definition. The technical report is there available as well. And you can also download the data available as well. Next slide, please. In contrast, I want to also present a state level DAC definition created by the Washington Department of Public Health and Environment in partnership with the University of Washington. And this definition uses a different approach. It's a indexing or formulaic style approach to determining DAC status. Rather than simply determining DAC status for a census tract, this approach attempts to determine which communities are the most impacted or burdened in an effort to evaluate cumulative impacts of environmental health risks. And I should note that this approach is originally adapted from California's DAC definition, which was originally published back in 2017 by the California Environmental Protection Agency. But in this approach, excuse me, indicators are ranked and normalized into deciles, which are averaged within categories and plugged into a formula whose final product is a composite score assigned to each census tract in the state. You can see this approach, it's written out a bit more in this graphic here on the right. And I won't go into more detail on the ins and outs of this specific formula, but I invite you to visit their website, which is linked, and encourage interested parties to read more there. Now, could I get the next slide, please? So you may be asking yourself, what do these differences mean in practice? On this slide, you'll see three maps of the state of Washington. The first on the left is overlaid with the national scale CJUST stack layer, with the middle representing the Washington state environmental health disparities layer, and on the right, both layers overlaid on top of each other. You can see that there's a clear difference in the spatial distribution of where the different DAC census tracts are located, with some overlap, but just how much overlap? Visually, we can see that there appears to be greater land coverage by the CJUST layer and possibly more urban coverage by the Washington environmental health disparities layer. And if you could click next for me, please. Thank you. You'll see that this table, which was completed as a part of an analysis on the different DAC definitions that will be included in a forthcoming publication as funded by GODEEEP. In this instance, the Washington state definition identified 443 census tracts as disadvantaged, while the CJUST layer identified only 319, of which 186 tracts were chosen by both definitions or methodologies. So this creates a fairly similar story in the cases of Colorado and California. And what's the implication of this? The definition of disadvantage matters for the consideration of energy investments and siting, whether in the case of wanting these areas to be the sites of new infrastructure and job opportunities, or seeking to site away from these areas as a precaution and not wanting to further impact communities damaged by legacy pollution. And I want to take a moment just to emphasize that the equity environmental justice considerations are more than just layers on a map, but that this is just one method or one data-driven tool to assist planners in considering places that have historically been underinvested or overburdened in the past for one reason or another. Additionally, this is not the extent of our equity considerations within GODEEEP. Our team has projected jobs, employment, and income changes, as well as residential energy security and burden impacts, to name just some additional data products. You can hear more about these results in particular in Deep Dive 4, which again is taking place in August, and I invite you all to attend and learn more there. And with that, I'll pass it back. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. So we're starting to have a number of questions and clarification questions. So before we go into more of the analysis, I'll have the panelists just address those questions. The first one was on whether we consider storage facilities in the siting, and so that should be for Kostas or Kendall.
You want me to handle the interconnection cost and updating one first?
Well, can we get the storage first? Is that okay?
Storage first. Yep. I can talk about that a little bit, and then I know Kostas covered that in his slides, so I can let him talk a little bit about how that's factored into grid view modeling. So SURF does not currently cite storage, but this is absolutely something that is on our to-do list that we would love to build into the model. And the reason that it's a challenge that we haven't integrated it so far is that economic algorithm that I talked about is for power plant generation, right? Where the economic algorithm of where the best place for storage to go, storage to be sited, may look very different. There are different signals from grid operations that indicate storage would be a suitable resource to use there. Storage can be used as transmission. It can be used for market participation. It can be used for variable resource integration. And so taking all of these different kind of signals that we want to then build into an economic algorithm will definitely take a lot of consideration. And but it's absolutely something that we're going to consider building into the SURF model moving forward. And then Kostas, do you want to talk a little bit about how we're currently modeling storage as part of this experiment?
Yeah, thank you, Kendall. And there is a dedicated task in GODEEEP that explicitly addresses how we cite and size storage technologies. And because storage is more like on short-term operations, we use a lot of preview outputs that are fed as inputs to our modeling for sizing and citing storage technologies. So specifically, we consider transmission congestion information, as well as looking at specific substations with unserved energy, and we are trying to allocate storage in those weak spots of the grid that basically act as a virtual transmission line, or as an alternative to a transmission, to have a transmission line. That's the approach we follow. We also test different storage technologies with different duration capabilities, starting from 4 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours, and going all the way till 12 hours. But we're still exploring some of these sizing options, both in terms of the capacity, but also the energy of the storage technologies.
The other question was about, Kendall, if you could go into more details, go again about how the interconnection costs are estimated in SURF.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's technically two interconnection components there, and it depends on whether it is a natural gas plant or not, and I'll get into that detail a little bit more. But the general idea for calculating the interconnection cost in SURF is that we look at each individual 1 square kilometer grid cell, and we have a geospatial component that feeds into the SURF model of where each substation is located in our existing infrastructure. And what SURF will do is it'll look at the voltage level of that substation, and it will build the appropriate transmission line. It'll calculate the distance, so it's a $1 per kilometer metric that we use versus how many kilometers it would take to interconnect to that substation. And that's built in as our transmission interconnection cost, which is used for every single type of power plant And then if it's a natural gas fired power plant, we also have this additional natural gas interconnection cost, which is how we're building pipelines of specific diameter to connect to existing natural gas pipeline infrastructure. So that is the kind of simple overview there of how that interconnection cost is calculated and how it folds into the economic algorithm overall.
Excellent. I have two more questions, but for the interest of time, I'm going to put it there because some of it might be partially answered with the rest of the presentation. So if you don't mind, let's go forward on the end use cases, and then we will have more questions again. So Kendall, it's back to you.
Back to me. And I do want to point out that you are welcome to contact us via email and reach out, and we're happy to have more detailed conversations on any of this. I don't know if we managed to get through all of the questions in the time we have, but we're here and available for further discussion later on. Thank you, Natalie. So for the second half of this webinar, I'm going to walk through some of the results that I highlighted in those key findings at the very beginning. And I want to start off in this slide with basically what are we working with when the information gets to SURF? What is our capacity expansion plan even looking like to begin with? What do we need to actually site on the ground? And so what these two plots are showing you is the comparison between our decarbonization scenario and our business as usual scenario, both of which we're modeling. And this is showing our GCAM USA new capacity additions in 5-year time steps from 2025 through 2050. These are just new capacity additions. This is not cumulative. So it's immediately apparent looking between these two scenarios that we're modeling how much more solar and wind is in this decarbonization scenario. Solar is in yellow, CSP in that orange color, and onshore wind in green. And you're just looking between the two, and that's just, it is significantly larger how much more renewable capacity we're going to be putting on the grid there. The other thing I want to highlight looking between these two scenarios is that you'll notice looking at that kind of grayish box there, the natural gas capacity. So under the net zero, no CCS scenario, we're seeing that that drops off by 2035. We need to obviously stop putting that on the grid if we're going to meet our clean grid goals and put more renewables on. In our business as usual scenario, however, we see that that continues to grow over time and that we're able to dispatch that as part of the grid. And so part of the GODEEEP project overall and looking at the grid view operations in detail will let us look at how the grid responds to that loss of dispatchable resource versus our non-dispatchable resources. So this, just looking at the two high-level comparison, looking at the comparison of these two high-level scenarios here, you can immediately see that there's going to be repercussions in our downstream modeling efforts. And the larger comparison that I'm going to mostly walk through for the rest of these slides is looking at that geospatial component and the land use of that decarbonization scenario. And so next slide, please. If you look at our decarbonization scenario and you're asking the question, well, I know that renewables take more land. You can fit a nuclear facility within a 1 square kilometer, give or take. However, you cannot fit a 1 gigawatt equivalent wind farm within 1 square kilometer. It's going to take a lot more land to fit the decarbonization scenario versus the business as usual. And how much more, well, you can just see this is split out by state in the West. You can see how much more just California alone has compared to the business as usual scenario, where this is just showing through 2035 and already it is an additional 145,000 city blocks. And that is a considerable amount of land. I also gave it in almost 500,000 football fields there. So it's difficult to even picture the amount of land that this will start to take. And this is the reason we need to bring in that equity and environmental justice component so that we can start to evaluate what those impacts are, because there will be impacts, there will be trade-offs and considerations that we need to look at there as we're using this land for grid operations. One thing I do additionally want to mention, this decarbonization scenario does not consider carbon capture and sequestration. That was to align with conversations with the Western Interconnection and what they believe we should go with our modeling efforts. So decarbonization, no CCS versus business as usual. Next slide, please. So what does our SURF output look like through 2035? This is what the SURF model will actually give us. It gives us these nice maps and these data sets with coordinates for all of our build out. And you can look at comparing between the two. It's not immediately evident. If you were to kind of stand back and sort of squint at it, you'd say, well, they don't maybe look too different. The solar and the wind, which is the green and the yellow there, seem to be going in the same place. This is not surprising. The solar and wind resource potential is going to be consistent across these two scenarios. What is different is the quantity. On the left-hand side, you'll notice that those clusters of wind and solar are much bigger than they are in the business as usual scenario. And you're seeing that in places like if you look at northern Nevada there, for example, there are solar farms that don't exist in the business as usual case. So you're seeing this much bigger build out. And as I mentioned, that larger use of land towards that decarbonization scenario. Next slide, please. We can also look at the retirements coming downstream from the GCAM USA model and what that looks like between the two. And you'll notice that there aren't as many dots on the maps here because these are taking much less land for the same amount of capacity in these build outs. So for the net zero, there's additional retirement of that natural gas. We see that happening a lot in California and Colorado and places like that, versus the business as usual, not as many dots there. We're getting to hold on to that dispatchable generation for longer in our business as usual scenario, seeing about 132 gigawatts retired by 2035 under our decarbonization versus 48 in our business as usual. Next slide, please. So for the remainder of the slides I'm going to cover here with our takeaways is going to cover that geospatial equity component and environmental justice component, where I'm going to take these results, this SURF output, and we're going to see what it looks like when we bring in those considerations and where this land is taking place and start to kind of pull some insights from that. And I'm going to start with this disadvantaged community layer so that we can see where does our wind and solar build out, how it interacts with that layer. And this comes back to that first finding that nearly half of our power plant sightings are on disadvantaged community land. This is just the federally identified disadvantaged community, and you can see it with that gray highlighting there, how much of the space it takes. And this is equivalent to about 8,000 square kilometers. Next slide, please. So in addition to that kind of aggregate disadvantaged community type, we're also able to look at this in a lot more detail. We have these geospatial layers where that federally identified CGEST layer that Stefan talked about kind of flags if a community is any type of disadvantaged community. But he mentioned that there's a lot of different subtypes of why they might be a disadvantaged community. This can be climate, energy, health, housing, workforce, water, what name you. And we're able to collect these geospatial layers and actually do this analysis against each of our technology sightings. And where we can also do it at a state level, we have a lot to explore here. And so this heat map on the right-hand side, that first column is showing the overarching DAC type. This is the kind of catch-all disadvantaged community. So the intersection between our sightings and that, the percent of all sightings of that type in that community. And then you can also see the specific types of DAC communities and how that lights up. And this gets to kind of some interesting results there. You can see our biomass dry cooling is flagging with 75% of any type of DAC community, but those are mostly focused on climate and energy disadvantaged communities. Whereas nuclear, which also has a higher percent, is mostly related to health and workforce. So these are the kind of communities that we're seeing projected sightings in by 2035 under our decarbonization scenario. I do want to iterate the details I'm going to go into here. It's just going to cover the decarbonization scenario. We're going to just focus on that. I should have mentioned that in the previous slide, but this is what we're looking at here. One additional thing that I do want to point out on this slide, I know there's a lot of information, is even though those solar PV and wind percentages there as a percent of the overall sightings of those technologies are lower for intersecting with DAC communities, I want you to remember the amount of capacity that we're seeing and the amount of land that we saw in those previous graphs. And so even though those percentages are lower than biomass or nuclear, it's going to equate to a lot more land and a lot more capacity that's intersecting with these disadvantaged communities. So this really starts to open up opportunities for additional analysis here to see, like, is siting in a workforce disadvantaged community, are we going to be able to see that as an opportunity for encouraging siting in that location? And is that going to vary by technology type? There's a lot more to explore here, and we're barely just scratching the surface with this type of analysis. Next slide, please. The second one I'm going to focus on is sightings in important farmland. This has really been coming up more and more lately in the news and elsewhere. And what we mean by important farmland here, we're using this as kind of an aggregate geospatial layer. We'll have more details on the next slide, but important farmland here includes prime farmland, unique farmland, farmland of state importance, and farmland of local importance. And if you're unfamiliar with this information and data set, this is essentially just high value agricultural land. So land that we would potentially want to reserve for agricultural products that is more suited for producing agricultural products. And so we took this geospatial layer, which is not considered as an exclusion in our base siting, and we're able to see how it interacts with our power plant projections. And what we're finding is that about 12% of the land used for projected power plant sightings is interacting with this all-inclusive important farmland. Most of that is actually farmland of state importance, which you'll see on the next slide. But the overall message I want to give here is that where we're seeing these interactions between these layers, it opens up an opportunity for collaboration and looking into what the trade-offs might be between this land usage, what the agricultural value of land is versus what the grid operations value of land is. There's a lot of exciting different questions that we can ask here and additional collaboration and efforts to explore. Next slide, please. So this, just like the previous one, is going into a little bit more detail. That first column in the heat map is showing the overall important farmland, so intersects with any kind of those types of important farmland, whereas the rest of the columns are showing the specific types of important farmland. You'll notice that prime farmland, which is usually the one that's most discussed, it is generally the highest tier. There's not that much intersection because it's actually not as prevalent in the West as we see in other parts of the country. However, farmland of state importance does flag considerably. We see that biomass has a higher percent there, but because we're not seeing as many sightings of biomass capacity, there's probably opportunities to shift those sightings to different areas. Whereas if you're looking at solar and wind, again, that lower percentage, but huge amount of capacity, huge amount of land. And if you compare the two technologies there, it's going to be an interesting area for exploration, because when you consider wind, the land usage, so to speak, of wind, there's still space underneath theoretically to use for agricultural purposes. So it's maybe not as much of a trade-off to site wind on important farmland. However, when we look at solar, which when you think about it, you have these massive arrays of solar panels, and you're really only left with the space between solar panels if it's available at all for maybe agricultural purposes. So exploring solar is potentially where we might see even more interactions with like what that trade-off is going to be, where we need to do that additional analysis, bring in that agricultural trade-off component. Next slide, please. And where we're really seeing this is in Oregon and Washington in particular. Looking at Oregon, we're seeing about 56% of our projected sightings are on farmland of state importance, so pretty significant there. And then 1 out of 4 solar installations in Washington are on prime farmland following our projections. So these are two areas that we really we think additional research, analysis, collaboration will be really insightful. Next slide, please. The last sort of cross-cut investigation I'm going to show you guys is the proximity to environmental areas. So what we did, I mentioned earlier, a huge suite of geospatial layers that we have at our disposal, including various environmental protected areas. We consider U.S. national parks, outstanding natural areas, and we pulled out of that data set a collection that you see there in that, that list, including a bunch of others that are representative of these protected areas, environmental areas. And as you can see with the gray, there's quite a few of them, quite a bit of land in the West that's considered these sort of natural areas that are being protected. And we analyzed how close our sightings are to these protected and environmental areas. And the general idea there is to kind of assess areas where we may see local opposition to siting for environmental conservation reasons. We may just see that these are areas where, even though it is legally possible to site in these regions, the environmental assessment process may be slower. There may be additional considerations to explore here as you get closer to those legally and environmentally protected areas that you're seeing shaded here. Next slide, please. So what we're seeing is that there's a lot of protected land in the West. So a lot of our sightings are in proximity. We're looking at it within 1 square kilometer, 5 kilometers, and 10 kilometers of these areas in aggregate. And you can see in this heat map on the right that a lot of them are flagging within 10 kilometers. We have a lot of protected and natural area in the West. So this is perhaps not a surprising finding that we're seeing here. And about 80% of all projected sightings are within 10 kilometers. You're seeing mostly biomass, geothermal, nuclear are especially prevalent within 10 kilometers, 100% of those in some cases. And the takeaway here, and we're seeing that this is especially true in Oregon, Utah, and California to some extent, where we may see a higher risk of local opposition or a higher risk of a slower process for siting. And the idea of this slide and this analysis is not to say that the collection of protected areas that we collected here and analyzed with is the end all be all. This is the ultimate test of being able to see where local risks and opposition may be. This is just one crosscut. We have a huge amount of layers at our disposal, and there are additional ones out there that we'll continue to collect, and you can toggle these on and off and explore this from different angles. The idea is not to say that this is the black and white assessment and that every single one of our projected sightings will see opposition if it's in that location. This is very much an evolving science, and this is an opportunity for additional collaboration and discussion, and these areas that are seeing these potential risks for local opposition or additional analyses. It's more just we're trying to empower stakeholders here. We're trying to provide the information so that those additional studies can be conducted and we can actually start to down select some of those decarbonization pathways and explore what may be the trade-offs and what are the opportunities to potentially avoid these areas or see which ones have less impact and what have you. So we are barely scratching the surface here, and there's still quite a bit of work to be done. Next slide, please. So we've covered a lot of information in this deep dive in a pretty short amount of time, but I do want to leave you with a few high-level takeaways from what we've covered here. The first is that I hope we've communicated that evaluating the impacts of decarbonization build-outs is very complex, and it takes the integration of multiple models of varying types and granularities, and really we are leveraging the variety of backgrounds and expertise that we have available to us at the lab. But that this is a very complex process, and that it has taken quite a bit of work to get these models to speak the same language and get to these results. The second thing I want to leave you with is that decarbonization will require a significant amount of land for infrastructure build out. And it's really only going to be successful if we can fold in those social and environmental equity considerations and fold in those considerations for the communities where these power plants will be going in. Our modeling really needs to consider those efforts to be able to downscale these decarbonization pathways successfully. Third, we're seeing that our projections are showing that there may be significant siting in disadvantaged communities. That's at the identified federal level. However, as Stefan walked you through, there's different definitions of what a different disadvantaged community is. And so there's more analysis to be done to examine what the state level definitions of this is, or even other definitions, and how our projections interact with those. And lastly, our preliminary siting results are showing that different states and regions are seeing very different outcomes with socioeconomic and natural resource impacts. And the analysis that we're doing here, and the analysis we're going to do, and the data sets and models that we're hoping to empower others with can really help us understand and identify realistic decarbonization pathways. I want to thank you for attending this webinar, and I'm going to hand it back to Natalie, and she will field the questions that we are happy to answer. Thank you very much.
Thanks, our presenter. Before we go into the Q&A, so we're going to move forward with the deep dive. In particular, Stefan and Kendall alluded to deep dive 4, where we're going to talk more about the equity research. And Kostas also alluded to deep dive 3 on July 24 on how we use climate intelligence to size and design the storage. We'll also look into using this climate intelligence to design a stress test for evaluating the reliability of the infrastructure and the operation. So please register for those webinars. Something else too, so we have 70 people on the call today. Thank you so much. We'll try to go right away to as many questions as we can. There are a couple that were very specific, so please note the email addresses so that we can follow one-on-one. Like we said, the success for those webinars is for us to get your feedbacks, to get your technical questions so that we can fine-tune our work and be of more use directly for the users, but also we're scratching the surface on the number. We are really opening more opportunities. So all of the data sets are actually available, or they're going to be made available on godeep.pnnl.gov, so that some of the analysis, we're making some choices and assumptions, other ones could be done. And so please keep us posted. Please start from those data sets so that we can all, as a community, move forward faster on getting that transitions to net zero technologies. So very fast then into going in some of the questions. One I should have pulled up earlier. Could Kendall specify and clarify whether we use new transmission lines or not?
Sure. So currently we only site with existing infrastructure. We are not actually, when I say that SURF is calculating an interconnection cost, that line, that new transmission line, that new natural gas pipeline, if it's used, is not built into the grid view database of the existing infrastructure. So we're working with what's actually available to us. This is also something we're exploring in our research efforts, because we want to be able to reflect an upgraded and adaptive grid, because obviously we're going to see these build outs in transmission in new substation development that we want to be able to leverage. But this is not a trivial task to be able to add new substation, new transmission lines to this network. You need to be able to make sure that you are connecting it in a way that would be realistic. Where is that new substation going to be located? What other substations is it going to be connected to? What are the ratings and things like that? So this is a complex effort and something that we're absolutely exploring. But for this specific experiment, we are working with a static infrastructure related to interconnection.
Excellent. Could you also clarify, say, for example, you have a power plant that gets retired. Can you build a new power plant there? Or the question was, I reframe a little bit the questions to combine a couple, but if you have, say, natural gas that get retired, can it be the new places for nuclear? Similarly, if you have coal, can it be replaced with natural gas with CCS, for example? Make sure that you have the best use of transmission?
Yeah, absolutely. So when SURF actually does a model run for a particular year, it ingests this initialization set. And what that includes is on the ground power plants, right? So we are obviously at our starting point working with a huge amount of infrastructure that's already operating. We're not starting from a blank slate, and we want to make sure that we're not siting power plants on top of other ones, right? So we're bringing in this existing infrastructure so that we don't stack giant wind farms on top of other wind farms, because unsurprisingly, the resource potential for that is going to be pretty consistent. New wind farms will want to go where existing ones are. However, we're also integrating a retirement component for those pre-existing plants. So over time, you'll see those fossil fuel generators, those locations will open up for siting in SURF. So for example, if a natural gas plant were to retire in 2030, that space is then made available. And if it is suitable for siting for a particular technology, and that's a good location for wind to go, for example, absolutely, it will absolutely want to go there. That economic algorithm will encourage it to, because the interconnection cost will be lower.
We also had another questions on moratorium for nuclear. Is that something you could comment on as well?
Sorry, can you say that one more time? What for nuclear?
The moratorium.
Moratorium, right. So the moratoria component is actually something we talked about quite a bit, and it's incorporated into the GCAM modeling, not the SURF modeling. I know it was listed as a layer there in that diagram, And that diagram should actually be updated because it's no longer folded in specifically to the SURF suitability component. SURF tries to do things at a sub-state level rather than block out entire states, because we don't want to be caught up in the scenario where the GCAM model will hand us a power plant that we can't actually cite whatsoever in the SURF model. So we actually fold that modeling into GCAM USA and the consideration there. And Natalie, I don't know if you want to chime in a bit there on the conversations with the Western interconnection on nuclear specifically?
Not specifically.
Or I should say what the modeling of availability of nuclear buildouts in various states and how that was modeled in GCAM, where certain states now that have moratoria versus the ones that do not. We have the capability to model this any way that we choose to. So we could absolutely do a sensitivity case where we open up nuclear siting in various states that maybe are facing moratoria now.
And that will be one of the call out here, is that you can see that there is a number, like many assumptions that can go into the different scenarios. So we are looking for those feedbacks or suggestions, like, have you done this, have you done that? This is extremely useful for us so that we better understand what people have in mind. So thank you for all of those questions. There is another question, I think, Kendall, this is still for you, on have you considered the agrivoltaics? So that's the co-location of ag productions and solar productions as a way to minimize the trade-offs when citing solar, specifically with the results that you had.
Currently, we don't have an agricultural value to be able to do that calculation, but this is actually something we were just talking about this morning, to be able to fold in maybe modeling efforts from other research being done here at the lab, and to be able to build that in. So right now, our capability, we absolutely could build that in where we could determine areas like prime farmland, which we could absolutely exclude in our siting capability and see how that evolves the build out there. We can absolutely include that. We can look at state importance. This is what's so neat about this capability with all these geospatial layers. We can explore that. And so we would be able to necessarily say, you know what, that prime farmland we are determining is an area that will not be available for siting, and we can do that testing of it. But absolutely, that's a capability we would love to build in that does that sort of trade-off for agrivoltaics to be able to determine what the kind of joint opportunity is there.
There is another question, very good, that I'm going to address. The question is, if many Western states are phasing out fossil fuel plants, why are new natural gas plants part of our mix? And as part of the decarbonizations, we are talking by 2035, we are looking at a clean power grid. And by 2050, this is when we are aiming for a net zero economies and fully decarbonized grid. So there are a couple approaches here, but it means that by 2035, it takes time to build the rest of the grid. So natural gas is extremely important to provide that transitional reliability up to 2035. From 2035 to 2050, which we did not show today, we focus on 2035, but that second phase, 2035 to 2050, is when we have an electrification of the different sectors. And there is a ramp up, there is another drastic change in the infrastructure at that time. And that's when you'll see that there is no new natural gas plants after this. This is the case when we are running a decarbonization scenarios with no carbon sequestration, which was here when we were discussing with our stakeholders, that was the recommendation. There are also other scenarios where we reach the net zero transitions, but that have net zero where we're allowing the carbon sequestrations. And there we have new sightings of natural gas plants, but with CCS, and that's after 2035. So that's, I don't know if Kendall and others want to add to my answer here.
No, I think you covered it well.
Okay. I think we've gone through, there are a couple ones that are more one-to-one, and we are at 11:20. So I think that we are getting to our time here. So I really would like to thank all of the attendees. Thanks a lot for all of your questions. Left on purpose the emails from our presenters today. Please reach out to them. If you think that we did not address your questions, please send an email and we'll give it another try. Again, the success for today's and for all of our deep dives is to have more connections that are at a very technical level. Also, we acknowledge this is a huge endeavor. There are multiple ways to get there. The advantage of GODEEEP was to get this holistic approach all the way from climate, different decarbonization scenarios, all the way down to reliability studies with Great View and the equity research. As we mentioned today, as a take-home message, there are other assumptions that could be done. There are more work that can be done on the sensitivity. So please reach out on how we can support some of your new ideas so that you can go faster, further. Without further ado, thank you all of our presenters, and I'm just going to close the meeting. Thank you, everybody.